Hi, welcome to One on the Page. I'm Scott. It is time for another weekly reading wrap up for the week of 6 through 12 November. Let's go ahead and get started. I finished sort of 5 books this week. I will get into the sort of in a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and start with the first book that I finished. It is the one book so far this month that is a reread. It is Leave It Psmith by P.G. Wodehouse. Obviously, lots of P.G. Wodehouse in my reading. At least read one book a month. Do a podcast on Wodehouse monthly. So this one I did read before. When I first read this one, I hadn't read much Wodehouse last year when I started reading all the Wodehouse. I read through all the Jeeves and Wooster books, and then I read through all the Blandings Castle book, of which this is the second in that series. And I enjoyed it quite a bit on the first read around. Now, what happens, of course, is that I've read most of his other works, which include the Mike and Psmith series. That's the second book in the Blandings Castle series, but is the fourth and final book in the Mike and Psmith series. So it's one of the few times when two series kind of crosses. And when I first read it, that was my first introduction to Psmith. I hadn't read anything about Psmith before. This time, when I read it, I had read all the other Psmith books. And so I looked at it a little bit differently. I enjoy the Blandings Castle series. As a series, they're probably second only to the Jeeves and Wooster series. And there's a lot about the Blandings Castle that I enjoy even more than the Jeeves and Wooster, especially as you go on in the series and more characters are introduced. But this is the second one. There isn't a large cast at Blandings Castle. Of course, there's Lord Emsworth, there's his sister Constant, there's her husband Joe, who doesn't really show up in future works. There's Beach, the butler, who is there, but his role is similar to what it was in Something Fresh, the first book, whereas his role gets expanded and he becomes a very awesome character future in the series. In this one, not so much. He's like the Beach of the first book, not the Beach of the future books. And there's Freddie, Lord Emsworth's son, who I don't like, but I like. I like him as a character. Probably couldn't stand him much as a person. But there's a whole host of other characters that show up in the future. But this is pretty much what we're limited to. What we do have is Psmith. And if you remember from last month, I talked about Psmith in the City, and probably a couple of months before that, Mike and Psmith. Psmith is not one of my favorite characters. Psmith is one of those characters. I liken to I likened him to, and I believe I did this in the podcast, not on the video, but the Roadrunner. He's annoying and things always turn out his way and nothing bad ever happens. That's pretty much what Psmith is. He's in hard circumstances here, but nothing really bad ever happens to him, and he pretty much always has control of the situation, which I find boring. And he's he's an unlikable character, I think. Some people like Psmith. Some people like Eucridge, another Wodehouse character who I like in most of Psmith, except Eucridge is really he's definitely not upper crust like Psmith is. He's kind of down and dirty, and his plans often go badly, although, like Smith, he seldom is the person who suffers for it. So I'm have the Blandings Castle part, which I love, but there's not enough of because there's so much Smith in here. And I forgot to mention there's also the efficient Baxter, who is Lord Emsworth's secretary, who was in the last book and also plays a part in future books. He is a very interesting character who, quite honestly, is in the right, and yet we're supposed to root against him anyway, and we sort of do, but it's Joe, Constance's husband, has a stepdaughter that he really loves, but she has married somebody that Constance doesn't approve of, and he wants to give them money to kind of get them on their way, and she refuses for that to be. So Freddie, Lord Emsworth's son, wants to get some money from Joe to start a bookie business, and they kind of come up with this plan together, mostly Freddie, to steal Constance's necklace and report it for insurance. So get the insurance money, use that money, and then still have the necklace, and therefore they're able to get money so that Freddie can start his bookie business and Joe can help his stepdaughter without Constance really knowing anything about it. And his stepdaughter has married Mike of Mike and Smith. So sorry, that's a spoiler for some, but it's if you're going to read this book, you're going to see that pretty quickly. So Smith, in his one small attempt to help a friend, actually becomes involved in this. And there's mistaken identity, and there's the thieves, not just the ones I just talked about, but actual thieves. And there's poor Baxter, who maybe deserves it, maybe doesn't it. But it's a fun book. It's just got Smith in it. So I like the book, don't really care for Smith, but this is also his last book. Technically, I have to read another book because I skipped Smith Journalist because I figured these many Smith books in a row would really drive my daughter up the wall when we do our podcast. So I said that, well, we're going to do that one like in March or so. So, but this is the last Smith book that he published. And I'm going to give this one a 3.5. If it hadn't been for Smith, it probably would have been a 4 or 4.5. But I do know that better stuff comes in the Blandings Castle books. So just a small lump we got to go over. The second book that I finished was A Room with a View by EM Forster. This is a book I found on Audible to listen to. I don't have any credits right now, so I found a book that was included with my Audible plan. Found this one, listened to it. I had never read E.M. Forster before, never read this book before, and it was okay. I think I'm at the point now because I have read a lot of Wodehouse and I have read a lot of Agatha Christie. I have read a lot of other English authors from the early 20th century in the 19th century. Sorry, cats are doing something. And I'm a little bit tired of the class system in England right now. So this was kind of my fault for getting involved in this. But it's a woman goes to Italy, meets a man there who is of a lower class, but there's some attraction between them. her uh, cousin, who is basically her chaperone, tries to keep them apart. Something happens and they share a kiss, and then they all go back home. She gets engaged to another man who she met later in Rome. He is more of the class that is suitable for her. And then the other young man, George, moves in close to them, and all that happens. And I mean, you can kind of figure out how it turns out without actually having to read it. But I don't think it was a bad read. I just think I think I learned more about Cecil, the man she became engaged to, than of George. And I actually learned to like Cecil a little bit at one point, and then he kind of disappeared, and then he changed again, but it was off screen, and we don't really see anything with George that really shows me anything with this couple, with this man and woman in their love. It's more one of those things that it happens a lot in these books. We are told but not shown. I'm gonna give Room with a View a three. The next book I read, and I'm being very loose with the book, but what I am planning to do is I have ranked all the Stephen King novels, and I have ranked all the Stephen King novellas. My next step is to rank all the poems. No, I'm not going to do, well, I may do that, but I do not plan to do that right now. I'm going to rank all the short stories. So, of course, there are some short stories that I have not read. And there are some short stories I am not going to include in this. I will get into that when I do the short story videos. But I have 20 short stories that are not included in a Stephen King book. Now, I found out after I started reading these that 7 of those short stories will be included in You Like It Darker, which will be published in May of 2024, along with 5 previously unreleased stories. But these are the stories that I have not read before, that are not collected. So this book is the uncollected short stories of Stephen King, which I went through many different routes to read all of them. Some were pretty easy. There's at least one that is on Stephen King's website. Uh, there are a few that are in books that I already have that are the short story collections. I had to take a trial subscription to Scribd to read a couple other ones, but I have read all 20 of these short stories now. So I will just go over them shortly. I will go more in depth with them when I do the short story ranking. But The Glass Floor it's one of his earlier ones, and actually this is one I believe I had read before a really long time ago. If I didn't, it really feels familiar. Although I have to say, it also feels familiar because it's something that King touches on in a few stories, and I think a couple of them are in these uncollected short stories. But a man goes to see another man about his sister who has died. The other man is her husband. She died in a room where the floor is a mirror. And the man goes in the room and he sees the mirror and crazy stuff happens. The Blue Air Compressor. I definitely have read this one before, but again, it was a long time ago. It is not collected for a reason, I think. It's very interesting for the fact that it includes author intrusion. Stephen King is essentially a character in here. He is a character as the author of the story, but he is talking to us as Stephen King about the story. That's interesting. Pretty much nothing else in this story is not. Again, this is an older story. Some of his older stories, if they weren't collected, there's generally a reason why. Weeds, that is the lonesome death of Jody Verrill. If you've seen the Creepshow movie, that's a story that is based on. That's one where Stephen King plays Jordy, and he talks about meteor shit. That's a very funny segment. The Creepshow comic is very funny. This one's somewhat funny. Uh, it's one of the times where I think the movie, at least this part of the movie, is better than the story. I think the comic is better than the story too. So this was not a bad story, just better in the movie and in the comic. The Night of the Tiger, interesting. One that's set at a carnival, which he has gone to the carnival a few times, most notably in Joyland, which I think is much better. But this one was fine. It, it, I think the premise is a little silly, but I think it was done well enough. Man with the Belly. I don't know if this is his worst story. I'm still figuring out the rankings. But if it's not his worst story, it's at least in his top three worst stories. I don't think King does very well with the criminal underworld. There is a mafia hitman in here. There's a mafia don. There's a few scenes I think that older King would probably be like, yeah, I shouldn't have written that. It has been published in books, but of course it has not been published in any Stephen King collection. And I think that says something. Very bad story. Just bad. There are a lot of stories that I will be ranking near the bottom that I will find something good in there. There is something good in there. This is not one of those stories. The Crate, another story that Creepshow used. I again, I think the movie did it better. If you've seen the movie, a professor finds a crate. There's something living in the crate. It eats some people, and he goes to his friend for help. His friend has a very shrew wife, which in the movie we see more of. In here, we don't really see her. We just hear about her. I mean, she shows up, but we don't really get to see why she's so bad. So what happens isn't as impactful as it is in the movie. It's an okay story. Before the play, this is something that was written at one point. It was going to be basically the prologue to The Shining. One thing I am not doing with the short story rankings is including stories that were published that later became part of the novel. The revelations of Becca Paulson, I believe, for the Tommyknockers, or Memory for Duma McKee. This did not become part of The Shining, so I feel comfortable including it. It was fine. I think it would have worked as a prologue, but I understand why it was not put in there. It wasn't necessary, and it revealed some things that the novel gives you time to discover. The Reploids, I did read this one a long time ago. I can't remember what book it came in, but I know that there was a Dan Simmons story in it. Uh, uh, I I can't remember the story. I'll put it here, but the character, and I think part of the title is Vanafucci, I believe, about a man who's basically just angry at God. I remember that story. I sort of remember this story. Johnny Carson gets replaced by an alternate universe Johnny Carson. Didn't really have an ending. It was fine, but it didn't have an ending. So the old dude's ticker, not very good. Basically a retelling of the Telltale Heart. Pretty bad, actually. I didn't have. I ranked like 7 stories I thought were the worst. I did not have this in it. I may have to move that a little bit closer. The Rock and Roll Dead Zone was basically a Stephen King humorous story that he wrote for the book for the Rock Bottom Remainders, the band that he was in with a bunch of other authors. It's harmless and silly, not particularly humorous. So, but it's near the bottom, but it's not the worst. Cookie Jar. This has been included in the paperback release of one of his short story collections. I don't remember which one it was. It's an interesting story. There are questions that are not answered that I really feel need to be answered. The Music Room. This is based on a painting of an author that I can't remember the name right now. It's basically a little slice of this couple's life. They're not good people, or if you want to be generous, they're doing bad things in a very desperate time. But it's not really a story, it's just like a little snapshot. It's fine, but it's not good. The Turbulent Expert, which I have read in the book Flight or Fright that Stephen King edited, uh, it's another one where people are doing mysterious things, and that's interesting, but why and who are the people behind it? And I think I need to know that. And Stephen King thinks, no, we're fine with this. And I'm like, okay, dude, but oh, okay, it's okay. But I really want to know this. No, you'll take what I give you. Okay. Lori. This is the one I read on Stephen King's site. It is one that is going to be in his collection coming up, as is the Turbulent Expert. And so far, I believe that's of the ones that are going to be published. Those are the only two that I'm. Oh, I think the Music Room is too. It's a very good story. It involves a dog. Uh, is the dog really essential to the story? No, but yes, because there are things that happen in the story that aren't essential to the story, but it's about grief, and it's about getting old, which Stephen King does really well now. He's been doing that well for a while, though. Go back to Insomnia. Very good story. Squad D, this was a story that he had written for Dangerous Visions, edited by Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison wanted changes. King didn't make changes. I know it was published in something else, but again, one that hasn't gone to collection. I think it's a decent story. I think he made the choice to look at it through a certain character's point of view instead of another, and that's a valid author choice. It's just not the one I would want. It almost feels like he had a vision for what the end of the story was and wrote the story to get there, whereas I think the story would be interesting through another character's eyes. The fifth step, another one that is going to be in a new collection. A man confesses to another person what he has done wrong, because that is the fifth step of the Alcoholic Anonymous program. You can see where this story is going pretty much through the entire story. I think the writing is great in this. I think there's a lot that could be done with this, and I think he wrote a Stephen King story that we were expecting, and I'm a little disappointed at that. Stephen King has his tropes, and I think this one just went down, I'm writing a Stephen King story. Another story that's going to be in the collection, On Slide In Road. Basically, it's an homage to the Flannery O'Connor story. What is it? Good Man is Hard to Find, I believe, which I have read, but a long time ago. This is essentially a retelling, but unlike The Old Man's Ticker, which was an homage to Tales of Heart, I think this one's pretty good. As stories go, it's interesting in itself. There are some philosophical questions that I still ask myself after about characters and what they do and what other characters feel about what they've done. Another one, Red Screen, going to be in the collection. Not a good story. I believe King has used this phrase before, but it's like a fingernail paring of a story. There's just really not much to it. It's like somebody says, "Man, I have got a punchline. Now I just have to figure out the joke for the punchline." Willie the Weirdo, another collection one. This was pretty much Stephen King retread. It was not bad, but when I got to the end and saw what he did with the end, I was like, yeah, should have seen that coming. And I didn't see it coming because I was going, oh, there's going to be something else. And no, he gave me what I should have expected, but I did not. And Finn, which will also be in the collection, is it's set in Ireland. It's about a young man who gets kidnapped basically because of because of case of mistaken identity, and he is tortured. And basically, what happens there, and then it just kind of fizzles away. So, I mean, 20 stories, 7 of them will be in a collection. 13 of them have not been yet, and some of them are almost 50 years old, or I think at least one of them is over 50 years old. Some of these I did like, though, except for, I would say, Man with a Belly. I found something interesting in every story. Nothing redeeming about Man with a Belly, just utter dog shit of a story. But I'm going to give the overall collection a 3.5. It's a light 3.5, but like Glory, a great story that I really enjoyed. And some of the other ones are good. Like even the Reploids, which I thought not a good story. I think it started out well. I think the thing that people say about Stephen King endings doesn't really apply as much to novels, but I think it does apply far more often to short stories because, yeah, have had some bad ones. The next book was Cakes and Ale by W. Somerset Maugham. It is not the first Maugham book I read. I believe I read The Moon and Sixpence. I will have to correct it. It's the one that's basically based on the artist. Are you okay, dude? Okay. Based on the artist Gangwin. One of the characters is named Strickland, and I learned about this book from a Stephen King book, Bag of Bones. Cakes and Ale is about many authors. One very famous and cherished author, and another author who knew him when the second author was a boy and first author was a much older man. The esteemed author, was married to a barmaid, and the barmaid got around. Uh, Quite a bit, actually, it seems. Uh, I like the book. I think. See, in the preface to this, basically, Maugham talks about how he had this character, Rosie, that he really just loved, and he basically put her in the book, and then she's in the book, and she's not really as much in the book as I was expecting from what he was telling me in the preface. It's like you're talking to me more about these, let's admit it, boring ass authors. I want to know more about Rosie, and when I do learn more about Rosie, I am far more interested in her than the authors. And it was a good book. I just think it's another one where the spotlight of the novel was directed in the wrong place. I'll also say I listened to this on audiobook, and this book was published, I believe, in 1930. So I figured a book published in 1930, this will be fine. Well, not that there's anything wrong with it, but I was not expecting it. And there's not a sex scene, but there is a scene where we know there is sex going on, and that I just had picked up my kid from school, so I was like, I'm gonna turn this off for a little bit. So now I'm listening to something where I'm pretty sure there's not going to be any sex scenes in it. But overall, good book. I just was expecting more highlight on Rosie. 3.5. The last book is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a book that I'm reading for my family book club. I will get the good out of the way first. I like the story that Evelyn is telling her biographer. I like all the past Evelyn stuff. That stuff to me is interesting. That stuff to me is a good book. The present day where she is talking to Monique, the biographer, complete dog shit. It's just bad. The use of coincidence, and I don't care for Evelyn at all. I won't spoil things, sort of things that I cannot say, but I don't like the ending. I will say I prefer that things happen differently for her. I think she got off too easily. I think she was not a dynamic character. She did not change, and she is abusive. And people probably say I'm wrong about this. I think sadistic. Perhaps people won't think so. I think Evelyn of the Seven Husbands part, where she goes over all those marriages and everything, I was fine with that character. If it had just been that and like a little epilogue for Evelyn, I would have thought this was a great book. I really liked all that. Everything in the present day, I'll call it that, sucked. I will say again, dog shit. I don't understand character thinking here. I again, I'll just say I know lots of people like this, and I know one person who has already finished this in my book club has said that he likes it. I I I enjoyed the novel overall, but the framing story of the present day really dragged it down. I'm going to give this one a 3. It's just, and the past one, that's probably everything that's said in the past, probably like, I would say like a 4.5. It was great. Everything said in the present, uh, that would be like a 1 star, maybe that high. But yeah, overall, 3. If you like it, I understand. There's a lot to like about it. Just it, you covered my beef Wellington and vomit, and it's like, yeah, that's a delicious beef Wellington. He threw up on it. So I am still reading A Christmas Carol, of course. We have just gotten past meeting Marley's ghost. We're about to meet the ghost of Christmas past. I am reading other books, of course. Still doing the extreme horror thing. I'm going through the book Girl Flesh very slowly. I DNF'd a book, Peter Straub's Dark Matter. I just couldn't get into it. I will probably try again sometime in the future, but I've been reading that book for like 5 weeks and I've gotten 10 pages into it. I am still reading Hobgoblin by John Coyne, reading that one slowly, but I am progressing. I am also reading Wildwood Road by Christopher Golden. Still progressing a little bit slower than Hobgoblin. I have started The Gold Bat by P.G. Wodehouse because I'm going to be doing a 5-year battle with P.G. Wodehouse, and there are some P.G. Wodehouses that I still have to read. So that is it for this week. Please like and subscribe, leave a comment. I will talk to you next time.